This is Rob Oram. Thanks for listening to my podcast. The next episode will start in just a moment. But before it does, I'd like to ask you for a favor. Actually, two favors. If you're finding my podcast to be helpful to you, it would be really helpful to me if you would click on the follow or subscribe button. There's no cost involved at all, but that would just help boost my listenership. Also, if you'd be willing to just take a minute and write a brief review, that would be really helpful to me as well. Thanks for considering doing that. And now, on to today's episode. Well, hello again. Welcome back. And as always, thanks for listening. Today, I want to address the question, how can I change my spouse? That is a loaded question, but I know it comes up often in my counseling practice, and I'm assuming because you're listening to this episode that perhaps this question is relevant to your life. So let me just start off by saying marriage is the greatest blessing in life. But if you've been married for a while, you also know it can also be the hardest trial. It's both. And, when you think about it, why are we surprised at this? If you think about marriage, you're taking two broken, wounded, imperfect, sinful, selfish people and putting them together and mixing their lives up in every possible way and then expecting it to turn out good and feel good. So, if you're frustrated or disappointed or exasperated by your spouse and your marriage relationship right now, you're not alone. Welcome to marriage. Now, some of you may be thinking, but Rob, does it have to be like it is now? Is there no hope for change? Is there any way that I can get my spouse to change and be different? And that is what I'm going to wrestle with the rest of this episode. And I have some thoughts that I think will be helpful to you. I can't talk about every dynamic and aspect of this issue, but here are some practical, helpful, relevant thoughts for you to take away today that I think can make a difference. The first one you're not going to like, all right? I'm going to start off and ask you a question. Here it is. Why do you want to change your spouse? Why do you want to? You really need to spend some time and think about your response to that question. Now, let me say right up front, if you're in a marriage relationship where there is any kind of abuse or an addiction or an affair, those issues need to be dealt with. Those are not situations that need to be accepted or are acceptable. Those things need to change. And if you're in a situation where you are not safe, your first step is to take you, and if you have children, and get to a safe place now. And you're probably going to need to get some professional help with any of these situations. So I just want to make clear up front, the counsel I'm going to give today is not relevant in situations where you're being abused, or where there's some type of addiction, or there's been or is an ongoing affair. Those things are unacceptable, should not be tolerated, need to be dealt with probably professionally. I hope I'm making myself clear about that. But putting all those things aside now, sometimes the frustrations and disappointments we experience in our marriage relationship are more about what I'll call personality differences. Quirkiness, little idiosyncrasies, habits, tendencies, things that perhaps rather than changing them, you need to really think about accepting them and appreciating them. In other words, maybe you need to stop trying to control your spouse. And this is something, again, I'm throwing this out for you to think about and encouraging you to pray about. Ask God to show you if this is what's really going on. So the first point, again, I'm throwing out the question to you, why do you want to change your spouse? And assuming it's not to dealing with abuse or addiction or an affair, then we're talking about this gray area that could have to do with personalities and you trying to change or control your spouse. And maybe God is asking you, challenging you, calling you to do some changing in your own heart, to accept them for who they are. Now, moving on, my second main point here is that you can't change your spouse. But, there's a but you can influence him or her towards change. You can't change them, but you can have influence upon them to perhaps encourage them to move toward change. Only God can change a person's heart. And maybe you need to stop trying to be God. So, Rob, how can I influence my spouse then towards possibly changing? How can I influence him or her? Glad you asked. Let me give you 4 specific things that you can do to influence your spouse. And the first one may be obvious, but it's super important, and that is communicate. You need to communicate with your spouse. You need to talk about things appropriately. I always quote the verse, speaking the truth in love. You need to sit down and share your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, your needs, your expectations. How is your spouse supposed to change or be whom you want them to be if you haven't expressed that to them? Now, this is a big step that's going to require a lot of work. I did an episode specifically on communication that you might want to listen to first. Good communicating takes intentionality and a lot of work and practice, but you need to do it. And if you do it, just communicating with your spouse can influence him or her and perhaps motivate them to want to and to be able to change. I'm just going to tell you up front now, as you're communicating and you're talking about issues, compromise is going to be required. That's just a part of marriage. And also, sacrifices are going to need to be made. For 2 people to get along in a marriage relationship involves not only communication, but compromising and sacrifice. And I'm just telling you that up front. So as you're talking and communicating, you remember you're not going to get everything you want exactly as you want. So that's the first thing you can do to influence your spouse. It's just communicate, just share with him or her what you're wanting and feeling and needing and desiring. The second thing, and again, you're probably already doing this and maybe you're not, but you need to be praying. Pray about the situation. Pray for him or her. Pray about your relationship. You know, the Apostle James assures us that prayer is effective. And I know sometimes for me, when I don't see answers right away, I question that, but I have to keep doing what the Lord told us to do, believing it does make a difference. So let me just ask you, have you really intentionally been deeply, consistently, specifically pouring out your heart to God and praying to him about your spouse and about your relationship? Have you been doing that? Or have you been more trying to fix things and take care of things on your own? This is just a challenge to you and a reminder to you. Start praying. God knows what's going on. He cares about you and your marriage and your family. He wants to be involved if you will let him. And he is able to make a difference. Nothing is impossible. And I just want to encourage you, as you're praying about your marriage and about your spouse, make sure you're praying about your side of the problems and not just about his or hers. Be open to letting God reveal to you what you might be doing as a part of the problem. So that's pray. The third thing is be an example. Be the spouse that you want to have. In other words, I'm encouraging you to model the behaviors, the attitudes, the habits, the priorities that you want to see in your spouse. Model them. Be an example of them. Is your spouse really short-tempered? Model to them patience. Show them what a patient response looks like. Is your spouse irresponsible? Be the responsible person. Model to them responsible behavior. Show them what that looks like. Is your spouse unaffectionate and cold and distant? Well, model to them what being warm and affectionate looks like. Show them. Demonstrating to your spouse the behaviors, the attitudes that you want to see in them will help them see what it looks like, help them understand, and maybe even show them how to do and be those things. So be an example to them of the things that you're wanting and needing to see in them. And the fourth thing I want to throw out to you is, we'll just call it praise or positive reinforcement. When your spouse says or does something that you really love, that you appreciate, that is what you're longing for and looking for and wanting and needing, let them know. Thank them, acknowledge it, recognize it. Let them know how much you appreciate it and what it means to you. And let them know that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm looking for. Let them know, appreciate it, give them that positive reinforcement. That is going to encourage and motivate them to do it again. The flip side of this is you've got to really be careful not to always be negative and criticize and point out their faults and their lacking. That's not motivating. That's not encouraging. You need to intentionally, consciously encourage and reward the behaviors and the attitudes that you want to see in them. In other words, you need to train them. And that may seem weird, but training is okay. It's okay to train your spouse in a respectable, appropriate way in how you want to be treated and what you're wanting and needing. Training is okay. All right, here's another big point I want to make in this whole issue about how we can change our spouses. The third point is that you need to adopt and maintain a biblical perspective on marriage. This is a big one. You need to remember to always think about your marriage and your spouse from a godly, biblical, Christ-centered perspective. This is very different than how the world views marriage and relationships. Let me give you a couple examples, specific examples of this. Number one, in Matthew chapter 7, the first few verses, Jesus talks about taking the plank out of our own eye before we try to remove the speck from our, in this case, our spouses. In other words, you need to intentionally be paying attention to your side of the problems and how you're contributing to the difficulties. Not only that, but you need to be asking God to reveal them to you and asking for God's forgiveness when he does and receiving his cleansing and asking him to change you. In other words, don't just focus on all the things that are wrong with your spouse. Start with coming to God and asking him to show you how you're contributing to the problems. That's number one. Be aware of the plank in your own eye. Number 2, similarly, don't just focus on your needs, your desires, your feelings, and your thoughts. The Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says, don't just look out for your own interests, but also the interests of others, and put their interests before your own. Now, this can be taken too far, and I'm not going to get into that. But I'm just saying, rather than focusing all the time on yourself, make it a priority, make it a goal to intentionally try to meet your spouse's needs and desires, and to appreciate the positives. There are positive things about your spouse that can get overshadowed by all the negativity. You need to acknowledge and recognize and thank God for the positive things in your spouse and in your marriage. But don't just focus on yourself. Focus on the needs and desires of your spouse. And as you do that, that's going to encourage your spouse to do the same. And similar to this, point number 3 of this section, is you need to be the spouse that God is calling you to be. What is God calling you to be? Well, real briefly, you can read about this in Ephesians chapter 5. But I'm just going to focus on a couple highlights. You need to love your spouse. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. You need to submit to one another. It says, wives, submit to your husbands. But before that, in verse 21, it says, all believers are supposed to mutually submit to one another. You're supposed to be willing to sacrifice for each other, just like Jesus literally sacrificed himself for the church. You're supposed to have respect for one another. In other words, what I'm saying here is focus on being the husband or the wife that God has called you to be, despite whether or not your spouse is doing the same. Well, Rob, why should I do this if he or she isn't doing it as well? Because you love and you serve and you want to please the Lord. That is why. You're not doing it to get it back from the other person. You're hoping you will, but that's not your motivation. You're being the wife and the husband that God is calling you to be to please God. Let your motivation be to love and honor and please Him. Not yourself, not your spouse, not your family. Him. Let your primary motivation in all of this be to please and honor and obey and serve and love the Lord. That is the motivation that is going to carry you through even when you're being disappointed from the lack of response from your spouse. And the last main point I want to remind you of, you need to always remember the ultimate purpose of marriage. It's not about your happiness or your fulfillment, despite what we get out in the world. That's not the ultimate purpose of marriage. From a biblical perspective, life itself and marriage are about your sanctification. And that is a fancy word for you becoming more like Jesus. God is using your marriage, God is using your spouse to make you more like His Son, Jesus. And remember that marriage is a reflection, is a witness to the world around us of who God is. And a part of that is God using our spouses to refine us, to change and build our character, to make us more like His Son, Jesus. And that isn't always fun, but it's good. And we need to remember this big picture perspective. So in conclusion, I just want to again remind you, only God can change a person's heart, and that includes your spouse. But He can use you to influence your spouse towards change if you will let Him. So allow God to change your heart first, and then watch and see how His work in you impacts and changes your spouse. Thanks for listening. I want to invite you to visit my website at roboram.com. That's R-O-B-B, two B's, O-R-A-M.com. You can learn more about me and my counseling practice, and you can also reach out to me to schedule an appointment or a speaking engagement. And also, just a reminder, if you'd be willing to click on the follow or subscribe button and maybe write a brief review, that would be super helpful and appreciated. Thanks.